All right, people, we're finally here. The trip is paid off. 8 hours of hiking has finally come to its conclusion. Behold, the Love Shack. And just like I suspected, I'm the only motherfucker who bothered to show up on time. Hey, CP. Yeah, whatever. Hey, where are you and Lee at, man? I'm already here. I'm not bullshitting you. I'm already here. I'm standing right in front of the cabin right now. The camera's rolling and everything. Everybody's waiting on you two. I know the video gets uploaded when I upload it. Just figuratively speaking, everybody's waiting on you. Let's semantics aside. Where the fuck are you guys at? What are you talking about? You're bringing an Uber. We're supposed to hike, man. It's about the experience. This place is like a half-hour drive. I fucking hiked 8 hours. God damn you. Alright, I'll see you guys when you get here. Alright. Yeah. Fucking douchebag. Well, guys, they haven't left Papa John's yet, so looks like it's just us for a couple hours. So, since the other two couldn't bother to be showing up on time, why don't I just go ahead and skip to the good part and tell you guys the story of Camp Blood. So Friday the 13th tells the story of a group of teenage camp counselors who are restoring the old, famed, and possibly cursed Camp Crystal Lake, while one by one they are murdered by an unknown assailant. Well, here we go, everybody, the kickoff point for my Friday the 13th review series. Just like all the other review series I've done, same setup here. I'm going to review every single movie in this long-ass Friday the 13th franchise and end in a ranking video, which I'm going to do my best to do by April 13th because that is a Friday the 13th. Damn, I planned this good. This is by far the most requested and most demanded thing that has been on my comment section for like the past year. When are you going to do a Friday the 13th review? When are you going to review the Friday the 13th movies? When are you going to rank the Friday the 13th movies? Now, motherfuckers, we are starting now with the original classic Friday the 13th. So Friday the 13th came out right on the heels of John Carpenter's Halloween. John Carpenter's Halloween really was this huge explosion in the horror world at the time, and for the longest time, it was the most profitable independent movie ever made, and it really just kind of kicked open the door for the slasher genre. And if Halloween kicked open that door, Friday the 13th tore that bitch off the hinges. Friday the 13th is not only unarguably one of the most popular, if not the most popular, if you kind of take a poll of any of the slasher franchises, but it's definitely the longest lasting. There are 12 of these movies, 13 if you count a fan film that I'm also going to be reviewing. Man, that is just an insane amount of sequels for a movie that started off as undoubtedly a Halloween ripoff. And I don't think it's taboo to say that. I think even the biggest Friday the 13th fan will acknowledge, and even the filmmakers themselves have acknowledged, yes, we literally had the instructions, take the title Friday the 13th and do what John Carpenter did. Here's your money, make your movie. And I'll start with saying this too, you know, Friday the 13th is the franchise of the big franchises that I have the least amount of experience with. I didn't grow up watching these movies. I grew up with Freddy, I grew up with Chucky, you guys know that. I watched quite a few of the Michael Myers movies, but didn't watch all of them until somewhat recently. Friday the 13th, I think I've seen maybe 3 of them until a year ago. I know that's sacrilege for somebody that's such a huge horror professed fan like me, but it's just one of those franchises that I didn't grow up with. My dad didn't have them. I didn't really have the desire to go check them out. Whenever I did see pieces of them on TV, they were edited all to hell, never really grabbed my interest. Finally sat down, watched the whole franchise about a year and a half ago, watched the entire franchise again in preparation for these reviews. Probably going to rewatch some of them before I actually film the reviews for those respective sequels. So now I know what I'm talking about with Friday the 13th franchise. Finally, I have joined the Brotherhood. And you know, I gotta be honest, when I watched this original 1980 film, parts of it I really enjoy, parts of it I really understand how that kind of started a new craze of this camp counselor, this campground slasher. But there's a lot of elements of this, which I'm going to get into, that I gotta be honest, I'm completely shocked at the level of success that this movie had, even all the way back in 1980, because there are some things in this movie that is a little bit rough. But starting with the things that I like, first and foremost, I really love the whole setup of the Friday the 13th franchise as far as like the lore and the urban legend of Jason Voorhees. Even in this first film, when Jason doesn't really show up except for that little tease at the end, the lore and the legend of that story, this kind of ghost story that you tell to kids around a campfire, I just love that origin and that kind of basis for that character and for the killer and for the horror of this franchise. It's definitely different than some of the other franchises that I've seen, and I just like that approach. I like that kind of ghost story that comes to life aspect of Friday the 13th. And it's a tragic story. You got some kid who was mentally handicapped, he was physically handicapped, he was left unattended or was possibly even bullied and pushed into the lake. They never really get into it. Nonetheless, the kid drowns while all the camp counselors were off doing their thing, and the mom does not take very kindly to that fact. But before I actually dive into Pamela Voorhees, another aspect that I like about Friday the 13th is that kind of whodunit POV style that they shoot this movie with. You never see who the killer is until the third act of the movie. All you see is the hands, you see the POV, you see the reactions of people while they're getting killed. You never really see anybody. You don't get any kind of hint of who the killer is. And I like that whodunit style because you kind of have this mystery aspect as you're going through it. But you're also kind of toying around in your head with, well, I wonder who the killer is. Is it this person? Is it that person? Is it going to be two people? Is it somebody that we haven't even seen yet? And I like that kind of wheels turning aspect that they put into the story of this, because most slashers, to be honest with you, storyline and kind of getting your mind working is the least of the priorities. It's just about carnage candy, throwing some tits on screen, getting everybody happy with those aspects. And Friday the 13th is probably the most well known for doing that. But as far as this first movie and even aspects of the next movie I'm going to get into, the mystery aspect of who the killer is, I enjoy it. I also have to admit too, just because I have such a soft spot for the era of the 80s, I love how this movie totally dates itself from the beginning. The outfits, the way people interact with each other, some of the ways that the movie's shot and handled, it is so dated, but it's dated in a way where it's kind of like a time capsule. You watch this and you're like, damn, the 80s was a crazy ass time. Look at those shorts. And even just to the way that people kind of go about their everyday lives and go about getting certain things done back in the 80s. Like the first girl that we kind of get introduced to in this movie, and the first girl to get killed in this movie, Annie, is hitchhiking her way through these towns to get to Camp Crystal Lake just for a job for the summer. That's not something you would do in 2018, all right? Back in the 80s, we didn't have Dateline and Google and all the other shit to tell us how scary the world was. Back in the 80s, it was just free, baby. I'm gonna hitchhike to that fucking job. No dangers out here. And while talking about dated aspects of this movie, one thing that surprisingly has not really dated itself at all is the awesome practical effects by the master Tom Savini. Tom Savini is just the fucking man in the horror world. If you speak his name, it's like the Messiah. All of the kills in this movie that they actually put some practical effects into, and they're not like cutaway kills, which there's quite a few of those too, but all of the kills where you get the money shot, the axe in the face, the arrow through the neck, all of that great stuff, the effects work is just awesome. Even watching the Blu-ray, which oftentimes kind of highlights the flaws in old effects and in old CGI and stuff like that, it holds up really well. And for a movie that's quite honestly kind of sidestepping a lot of the suspense and the psychological aspects that some other movies in this era went for and just kind of went for the carnage candy, they deliver on that. If you're gonna go for just putting bloody kills on the screen, you better make damn sure those kills look great. And the Friday the 13th kills are great. And we have Pamela Voorhees to thank for all of these great kills in this original classic.
How are you? Well, I'm Mrs. Voorhees, an old friend of the Christies.
The physics doesn't quite add up how a over-the-hill woman is able to have the strength to do a lot of this stuff. But you know what, we're not even going to get into that. It's not a movie that requires all that kind of thinking. But Pamela Voorhees, I'll be honest with you, this might be a controversial opinion. I think she's scarier than Jason in a lot of aspects. I mean, just the motivations behind her, the way that she kind of speaks to herself in her son's voice, the way that her eyes look, like even the scene whenever she's cracking open the door to get to Alice and she kind of looks in like Jack Nicholson at her. There's a lot of aspects to what Betsy Palmer brought to that character that just really ups the creep factor and really delivers a great finale and a great climax to this movie. Pamela Voorhees is not the name that you think of or the name that anybody talks about whenever we discuss Friday the 13th. It's always Jason for understandable reasons, but Pamela Voorhees I think is a really underrated killer and an underrated horror icon. Don't get me wrong, Jason's bigger, Jason's more physically intimidating, Jason's probably going to cause you a lot more pain while he is killing you, but if I'm stuck in a room and that sweet looking old lady is coming at me with that evil stare speaking, "Kill her, mommy, kill her," I'm probably going to piss my pants. And again, I just like the way that they kind of tied in the motivations and the reasoning for why Pamela Voorhees is killing people into the overall urban legend of Jason Voorhees. The Friday the 13th movies aren't really known for story, and I'm going to get into that, but just the overall lore that it builds around those two characters I think is really cool. And back before jump scares were the thing that we all loved to hate about horror movies, I gotta admit, the original jump scare they put in this movie with Jason coming out of the lake at the end in that dream sequence, that is a really effective scare. I could see a ton of people back in 1980 watching this in the theaters and jumping out of the seats, throwing popcorn all over their date whenever that scene happened. That is an effective scare. And I gotta mention too, something else that I love about Friday the 13th, which luckily all of these big three slasher franchises have in common, is a great musical score. I love the audio cues that go on in this movie, like the audio cues when someone's getting stabbed, the audio cues when someone's getting chased, or when they're running away, or when the suspense is building, and even the signature sound of ch, 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 ha, ha, ha. Oh wait, yeah, apparently that's not right.
You blew it!
Excuse me, fanatics.
And totally redeem yourself!
Now we can avoid the trolling. But now let's get into the flaws of the original 1980 Friday the 13th. Like I've been hinting at this whole time, story is not really the priority here. They got the lore building, they got the legend of Jason and Pamela Voorhees down pat. But as far as just the story, let's get these kids together so that somebody has a... But now let's get into the flaws of the 1980 original Friday the 13th. Now, I've been talking about story, I've been hinting at it this whole time. The lore building is on point with this movie and this franchise as far as building up the urban legend of Jason and even the urban legend of Pamela Voorhees. But the overall story of this original movie, let's just get these kids together at this camp so that we have a centralized location to tear them to pieces, it's not really all that impressive. There's not really anything story-wise that interests me about this movie. There's not really anything in the story that hooks me, that makes me want to sit through 90 minutes of it to see where the story's going to end. This is literally a slasher at its most basic level. This is kills and sex, and Friday the 13th was kind of, honestly, the patriarch of that entire template of kills and sex. Titties and blood. Now don't get me wrong, what they're going for, they definitely succeed at, but there are some opportunities for some more story, some more character development, some more interesting character interactions in this movie, and they just don't quite go for that. Now speaking of characters, this is the other kind of flaw with this one. I think that some of the further sequels do much better about this, but this original Friday the 13th, there's not really any characters as far as these main group of teenagers that I really even sympathize with. They're just kind of there. They're very stock characters. You don't really get to know any of them. They have a little bit of interaction here and there with some wonky dialogue here and there, some wonky writing here and there, but there's just no character that stands out in this besides Pamela Voorhees, and she's not the one you're supposed to be focusing on because she doesn't show up till the last 15 minutes of the movie. So even your final girl, Alice, she's one of the weaker final girls that I've seen because you don't really know much about her. She just kind of happens to be the one who is not picked off by the finale of this movie. And that's the other kind of setup that the Friday the 13th movies go for that I don't necessarily enjoy as much. Most of the other slashers, you know, you get into Nightmare on Elm Street, you get into Halloween, and even some of the other ones that I'm not going to get into, you have a clear protagonist by the 30-minute mark of those movies. You know, there might be a group of kids, you don't know who's going to be the final girl or the final one left to fight the evil at the end, but by the half-hour mark, you know who the story is focusing on, you know who they're trying to kind of give most of the character development, most of the good lines, most of the attention to. And Friday the 13th doesn't really go for that. They kind of just put stock characters in front of you, and you just kind of have to guess by the end, or just let the movie unroll and see by the end who's going to be left standing. And they don't give too much character development or too much of a spotlight onto the final girl, Alice, in this. So by the time you get to Alice versus Pamela Voorhees,
it'll be easier for you than it was for Jason.
Kill her, Mommy. Kill her. Kill her. Ah!
I honestly don't care if she survives or not. Pamela Voorhees is much more of an interesting character. She's the evil one, but Alice, sorry, not interested in you. And speaking of the showdown between Alice and Pamela Voorhees, that's another one that's maybe more in the middle between a pro and a con for me. I like how creepy Pamela Voorhees is, and I like how drawn out and how much hiding and seeking is going on between these two characters in the finale, but there are so many moments where you are just like screaming, like, you know, the cliche screaming at the television thing with horror movies where Alice knocks Pamela Voorhees out cold at least 3 times in the last 15 minutes of this movie, and she never finishes her. She just knocks her out cold. Betsy Palmer does, and falls down, and then Alice walks away, finds another cabin, and hides under a bed. And it's just like, what the fuck are you doing? And as a final negative, I gotta be honest with you, this is coming more from my annoyance that they completely redo this over and over and over again in the further sequels, so it's kind of unfairly makes me hate it the way that they do it in this original movie as well. I hate the whole trick that they do with the dream sequence and then the true ending.
The boy. Is he dead too?
Who?
The boy, Jason.
Jason?
In the lake, the one who attacked me, the one who pulled me underneath the water.
Ma'am, we didn't find any boy.
Then he's still there.
Where Jason pulls her under the water, and then she wakes up, she's in the hospital, everybody's okay, and they just tell her it was a dream, and the movie ends. I hate that. I think that Jason pulling her underneath the water is just such a perfect ending to this movie, and it even better sets up the further movies without that little tease, oh, it's just a dream sequence bullshit. So I've never been a fan of that little second ending. I'm not a fan of the way they do it in the further movies, and I'll get into that whenever I talk about those. So that kind of sours the last little bit of this movie for me. As much as I love the finale, and as much as I love that jump scare with Jason coming out of the lake, I think that they just kind of shit on it with that little reversed ending there. So I can't stand the way that they do that. And it's for those reasons, guys, that it just kind of, it baffles me how successful this movie was back in 1980. I know horror was very different back then than it is now, but there's even people nowadays in the horror community that are just such sticklers for story and character development and just deep, rich aspects of filmmaking in the horror genre, but they will defend Friday the 13th with their dying breath about how much of a genius classic it is, even though it makes all the wrong moves as far as writing, character development, story, all of the good stuff that you usually come to a movie for. So it's just funny to me. As much as I enjoy the fact that this franchise went on to be as successful as it did because it gave us an awesome character, it gave us some really good sequels, and I'll get into those, but it just baffles me. It's very funny to me how successful this movie was even back in 1980 because it is such a flawed slasher. And I hate to get into comparisons, but I just think it's also definitive that as far as opening chapters to a slasher franchise, when you're talking about Freddy, Michael Myers, Child's Play, and then you get into Friday the 13th, I think Friday the 13th definitely has the weakest opening chapter. You know, you have Nightmare on Elm Street, which is arguably the best of the franchise. You have Halloween, that is definitively the best of the franchise. You got Child's Play, which there's tons of fans that argue that the first one is the best of the franchise, if not just as good as the second one that's the best of the franchise. And then you get into Friday the 13th, and even though it's got a lot of classic, nostalgic appeal to it, I very, very, very rarely, if ever, hear anybody say that original Friday the 13th, that's it. That's where the shit was. That is the best of the franchise. It never got better than that original one. I never hear that. So it's just funny that Friday the 13th as much of a classic and as much as it's hailed, is one of the weaker installments of this long franchise. But all in all, guys, I gotta admit, rewatching this movie in preparation for these reviews, I enjoyed it much more, kind of trying to dive into it and see it for what it was, try to go into what I really legitimately like about it, what really legitimately bothers me about it. And even though this is not a movie that I grew up with, I do kind of have some nostalgic love for it because of all of those 80s aspects that I was talking about. So by far not one of my favorite slashers of the genre or the era of the 80s itself, or even this franchise, as you will find out later on. I do enjoy Friday the 13th for what it is and for what it accomplishes and for what it absolutely did for the slasher genre. Cannot take that credit away from it, no matter what I say is flawed. So if you're a fan of the 80s slashers, if you're a fan of the camp slashers, or if you're just a fan of the Friday the 13th franchise itself, this is a must buy. It's barely making this rating if I'm being honest, but I think that any horror fan deserves to have this movie on their shelves just for nostalgic purposes, if nothing else. So if you're a fan of any of those genres and you want to check out the original Friday the 13th that started it all, definitely go out and buy it. So what do you guys think of the original Friday the 13th? Do you find this as this genius classic, as one of your favorite horror movies and slashers, or the beginning of your favorite franchise if you are a Friday the 13th fanatic? Or are you kind of like me where you just see a lot of flaws despite a lot of things they did well, and it kind of baffles you how successful this movie actually was in the long run? Put all of your thoughts on Friday the 13th down in the comment section below, guys, and we'll talk about it. And keep your eyes peeled for the rest of this franchise review series, because Friday the 13th Part 2 is coming to you very soon. So keep your eyes out for that, guys. Please like, share this video, hit that subscribe button if you're not already a subscriber. If you want to check out my social media links, check out in the video description below for Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and my Patreon page, which is the best way to help support this channel, help it grow, and get some awesome exclusive content for your eyes only. So check all that out, guys. And if you want to check out some more of my videos, including the rest of this Friday the 13th review series as it unfolds, you can check that out by clicking right over here.